Joining us now is Waymon Burke. He's a political scientist. You were a professor, recently retired. He's also a political analyst. He's been in the political game for decades. What did you think? What was going through your mind when you got the news and you heard and you watched the television and you saw former President Donald Trump had been shot?
Well, it's very disturbing and very sad that political violence is never a good thing in a democratic society. And it's an affront to the democratic process. So it doesn't matter if people are supporters of the former president or not. This should shock all of us.
This is also not the first time there has been an assassination attempt towards a president or any member of politics.
Right. There have been a number of political assassinations throughout our history. 4 presidents have been assassinated. The last one, of course, being John F. Kennedy. Teddy Roosevelt, who was a former president in 1912, running as a third-party candidate, was shot during a rally, and the bullet actually went into his chest. That's where he actually got the term bull moose. The bull moose party he was asked how he was doing. He said, "I'm as strong as a bull moose." So that's where that came from. Of course, Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy Sr., was assassinated, probably changed the trajectory of history in 1968 with his assassination. The probable Democratic nominee that year was killed in Los Angeles. And of course, President Reagan was shot in 1981, and seriously. And we've had a number of other candidates shot. George Wallace, former governor of Alabama, was shot in 1972 while campaigning for the Democratic nomination in Maryland, and it left him paralyzed for the rest of his life, of course. So it's not new, but it's always shocking and tragic.
And one of the images we're seeing a lot with what occurred today in Pennsylvania with former President Donald Trump. He was shot, but then you see his fists go up in the air, and lip readers, he was saying, "Fight, fight." What type of message does that send as well, as far as strength, or as a political analyst, what do you think?
Well, certainly I'd say the former president understands media and media coverage. So I found that very fascinating that he had the consciousness to get that graphic. And I'm sure we will see that many times.
Now, we are in the middle of a campaign like we are every 4 years.
Yes.
Will this hurt former President Donald Trump, or does this benefit him in some weird way?
Well, I think we have to be careful about that. It certainly probably energizes his supporters. I think it's too early to tell whether or not what impact this will have on the final results of the election. But hopefully he will recover, and it appears that from what we've heard up to this point that they're not life-threatening injuries, although we must remember one person was killed in this and another remains in critical condition, and there could be others that we don't know about yet.
And that's why we are definitely staying on this topic, on this story, and we'll continue to bring the latest information. But again, I just want to ask you, when you heard the news, what was really kind of going through your mind? Was it like, not again? Or as somebody who has so much historical knowledge?
That's really the way I felt, not again. I was a younger person in 1968, senior in high school, when Bobby Kennedy was killed. That was devastating. It's also the same year that the Reverend Martin Luther King was killed. They were killed within about 2 months of each other, and it seemed like the country was coming apart. Hopefully we're not at that point, but there is great tension in the country, as we know, and I've always been an advocate that people who disagree on things should sit down and talk to each other. I've always thought that that was good.
And I was going to say, how do we lower the climate, lower the temperature? How do we bring more peace, even though we may have our differences and people have the candidate they favor more so? How do we de-escalate, especially after something like we just saw today?
Well, I think it's important. I always encourage people not to choose their friends and so forth based on their politics. And I have friends across the perspective, and it's always good to talk to them and debate with them and argue with them in civil tones. I think that's very important in a democratic society.
Do you think we're going to see a second presidential debate? I know with the first one there were some issues maybe with President Biden and his supporters thinking he should drop out of the race. And then
that's yet to be determined as well, because we had presumed that we would have these two older gentlemen facing each other. It still looks like at this point that President Biden is receiving tremendous pressure to withdraw, and because of his mental lapses and so forth that we've seen recently. I think it's too early. Fortunately, it appears, hopefully, that President Trump is not fatally injured or it damaged him in some way or whatever. So I just assume that he will be the Republican nominee. But I hope we see another debate, regardless of who it's between. I think it's important for citizens to see that comparison.
Now, former President Donald Trump, he had promised he was going to select his running mate this coming week. So in a couple of days, do you think that changes with what just occurred?
Well, he would need to do it, I would think, because the Republican convention, of course, begins on Monday, and there's a formal process by which not only is the president, does he go through a roll call by the states and the individual state delegates to get the nomination, but the same process applies to a vice president. So I would assume that that will move forward. The events of today will probably overshadow all of that, and I have no idea who is going to choose. We've heard of the supposed short list,
sure,
but we'll find out if that's a ruse or it's or we're going to be shocked as to who he chooses. Whomever he chooses will be ratified by the convention, I'm sure.
Now, there's been a lot of talk from President Biden's supporters for him to drop out of the race. Yes. It's kind of dominated headlines for several weeks. Do you think this changes the narrative within the political debate?
Well, it probably takes some media coverage, a lot of media coverage, off of that discussion. But there appears to be, from news reports, that there's tremendous pressure building up in Congress and others in the Democratic Party, of donors in the Democratic Party, to pressure him to step down because they worry about his ability on the campaign trail. And time will tell, but this will definitely take some of the attention off of that. I don't think it goes away, but it will divert our attention to other things.
And throughout this newscast, we've been talking about the different leaders here in the state who have sent prayers for President Donald Trump to get recovered.
As we all should.
Yeah.
Yes, and quite appropriately. And I think it's the gracious and right thing to do for decent folks.
And again, we're hoping more big announcements from former President Donald Trump, including who will be the running mate.
Correct.
Well, Waymon Burke, we appreciate your time.